atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cincinnati area attorney Joey Ashbrook.
Hey, Mike, great to be with you this morning.
Yeah, I am looking forward to doing the show with you. We haven't had a chance to do the show between just the two of us, and so I am eager to get at it and see how it goes. I expect we're going to have an interesting time. But before we do, I want to thank a few new supporters. There's Chris, not really a new supporter. Chris has been with us for years, recently increased his level of support on Patreon, so thank you very much. Also, Lon, who recently sent us a very generous donation, and Lon went old school with it. We got a check through the mail, which is really a cool thing to see. It really brightened my day. So thank you, Lon. As well, we also have two new trial Patreon supporters, Harlan Ray and Kenny. Thanks to both of you for taking that step. We really do appreciate it because as a scrappy independent show, not some big media podcast, your donations, your support really does make a big difference and helps us keep going. So thanks very much for that. And as always, if you want to support us or increase your level of support, you'll find a link in the show notes. All right. So to start with, we're going to talk about the story that's been dominating a lot of the news cycle. That's Ukraine and Russia and that Trump-Putin meeting. You know, Donald Trump famously pledged to end the war between Russia and Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. Well, nearly 5,000 hours since he took the oath of office, peace still isn't in sight, but, well, Donald Trump is once again attempting to keep that campaign promise. He met earlier this week virtually with President Zelensky and NATO leaders, and then on Friday, of course, the big meeting in Alaska with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Now, the bar was set low by the administration, at least for this initial meeting. You heard terms like feel-out meeting and listening session, that sort of thing. And even President Trump said, there's a very good chance we're going to have a second meeting that will be more productive than the first. Though he did reiterate before the meeting his earlier comment about severe consequences for Russia, though some folks have doubts, especially President Zelensky, who has consistently warned of Putin's duplicity, saying this week, Putin is bluffing and he doesn't want peace. He wants to occupy our country. And the concern from some people is that Trump will accept minimal concessions from Russia as a fair deal and then force Ukraine to either accept that or face the prospect of no further U.S. support in their efforts against Russia. And from what we know about the meeting between Trump and Putin, and again, this happened not even 12 hours before we started recording, I don't think, I'd say that concern might be justified. For instance, prior to the meeting, Trump told Fox News' Bret Baier that I won't be happy if I walk away without some form of a ceasefire. But he came away from this time with meeting with Putin, reversing that position, arguing for going straight to peace talks, which is something that's strongly objected to both by Zelensky and a number of Ukraine's European allies, because they see that as a way for Putin to further string things out while taking more territory and killing more Ukrainians. Now, Trump says that he plans to meet with Zelensky on Monday, and then, in Trump's words, if it all works out, we will schedule a meeting with President Putin. So, Joey, what's your take, I guess, both on the latest attempts by President Trump to broker a ceasefire or a peace deal and ultimately, some sort of lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think he's living up to his word. He certainly doesn't have control over what other actors do, but he's kept himself in a position where he's not controlled by Russia or even Ukraine, where the United States is forced to be in a position where they have to go along with things that are not in the United States' interest, where people have their own intransigence on either side. And I think the president's clear-eyed. I thought that the meeting with President Putin was interesting on many levels. It was a A+ display of statecraft by the president of the United States. He clearly gave the message that he's pursuing peace with vigor and energy in ways that would make Jimmy Carter blush and be proud. And he did so in a way that had deep, meaningful discussion, apparently, with President Putin. And as you mentioned, did not have a resolution at the moment that they walked out. But the president also was clear in an interview he did afterwards that he thought that the meeting went well and was a 10 out of 10. So I think in our world of instantaneous news cycles, this is an instance without knowing the future. And he said there's no deal until there's a deal. So he's staying clear-eyed. We have to let it continue to play out. I thought it was interesting last night watching some of the news programs across different cable news networks in the wake of the press conference that wasn't really a press conference after the end of their meeting, the conclusion of the Putin-Trump meeting. Everybody just so quick to have a conclusion about whether something was a success or a failure when it's still in process. And we have to let it continue to play out, because there's not going to be any peace if Ukraine doesn't agree to it. There's not going to be any peace if Russia doesn't agree to it. And the president, I think, is acting wisely in something that he knows that is not about him, but is a worthy goal that he's been running after hard. And if he achieves it, it will be transformative. I thought it was funny, and he got asked about this in his interview he did after the summit, but Hillary Clinton made a statement on a podcast this week that if he pulled off the peace process in Ukraine related to Russia, that she would nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize, which I thought was funny. But the president's clear-eyed. He's pushing hard. And I think this is an instance where it's incredibly interesting and worthy of deep discussion. But in terms of reserving judgment on Monday morning quarterbacking, we have to let it keep playing out so we know what we're Monday morning quarterbacking. It's still evolving and fluid.
I think the most important point in that is the last point you made, and I agree entirely. It's so easy to read too much into what is clearly sort of a first step sort of meeting, although it seems weird to call something a first step so many years into this, but entirely right. And I think it certainly is a fault, even if an understandable one, of the media to try to spin these stories out of very little information. Now, that said, you mentioned your sort of impressions of that, and I think that's a reasonable thing to do. My impressions were very different. You talk about President Trump being clear-eyed. I see him as being almost besotted, I suppose, with Vladimir Putin. I mean, he literally rolled out the red carpet for him. He applauded for Putin as Putin approached him, and it just felt to me after the meeting, Trump only spoke for like barely over 3 minutes. He let Putin go first. Putin talked for twice as long. The looks on their faces, I felt like there was one guy in that room who had the big dog alpha male energy, and it wasn't Donald Trump. And the thing is I think Donald Trump even gets this on some level. I mean, earlier in the week, when he was asked about trying to get Putin to stop targeting Ukrainian civilians, he said, I've had that conversation with him. I've had a lot of good conversations with him. Then I go home and I see that a rocket hit a nursing home or a rocket hit an apartment building. So I guess the answer to that is no, because I've had this conversation. And so it's weird to me because on some level, I think he gets that Putin is playing him, but I see him not as being clear-eyed, but certainly it's wanting peace. I believe he does want peace, but I think his ego gets in the way. And so when Putin threw him that bone, that complete ridiculous bone of, well, of course, if you had been president, we wouldn't have invaded. Well, that's a cheap thing for Putin to throw him. And it just seems to me that Putin is very smart. And I think he's far more strategically wise than Donald Trump. And I think he's playing him once again. I hope I'm wrong about that, certainly, but that's sort of my impression. But again, going to what you said, we're going to have to wait and see on that. Any thoughts on that?
Well, Mike, I do think you're wrong on that. I think that Trump is smart enough as a negotiator to allow Vladimir Putin a certain latitude of the way Vladimir Putin needs to behave in relation to the discussions for face-saving reasons for Vladimir Putin to increase the probability that Donald Trump is able to get him to the result that Donald Trump wants.
Okay.
So I think this is an aspect of Donald Trump that is not appreciated and recognized, because the word humility is not something you often think about with Donald Trump at first blush, but he's got foxy humility. And look, the man is a master negotiator. Doing deals is what he does. He is very sensitive to people playing games with him and what he calls tapping him along. And I think, though, he cares more about the result than whether or not Vladimir Putin is tapping him along, and he's willing to abide a certain amount of, quote, tapping along if it gets the result, because the ultimate goal is to get the result. And he is not, at the end of the day, he said he's willing to walk away. And I believe that because I don't think he's going to beat his head against the wall. But I also believe strategically he thinks there is a real chance for peace, or he wouldn't be pushing it. And his use of economic levers, and particularly secondary sanctions against Russia, and his willingness to do it, and what he did with the India tariff related to buying the Russian oil, he can have a significant detrimental impact on Russia's economy and on Vladimir Putin's standing and security as the leader of that economy. But I think one thing he understands that the libs struggle, that I don't know if they necessarily intuitively get, is that Vladimir Putin is the leader of the successor nation to one of the world's great powers over the last several centuries. The idea you cannot as effectively as possible bring him down to the level, and I don't have better language, of the neighboring countries, smaller countries' leader, and act like there's a parity, because that brings his stature down, that impacts him within his own country and within himself. You're painting him into a corner. And so your ability, if you're going to get him to recognize his self-preservation impulses and the reality that it's not a fruitful path, you want to maintain his greatest flexibility for reaching that conclusion, and emasculating him individually makes that harder. It makes it less likely, not more likely. And so I see him in his interactions with how he's dealing with Putin and how he's dealing with Zelensky and making it trilateral. He's keeping open the path of peace without Putin having a public humiliation dynamic of being told what to do by a smaller neighbor. That's foxy wise. That's what I see when I'm watching what he's doing, and I think that's foxy wise. Now, it might not ultimately work, and I think he knows that, because he cannot force Vladimir Putin to do anything, and I think he's clear-eyed about that, and I think he'll slap all the sanctions on, and it's going to destroy Russia's economy even more than it is. But he is maintaining the greatest latitude for potential possibility for Russia to do what is ultimately in Russia's self-interest and Vladimir Putin's self-interest, without letting other things get in the way. And I think that explains what we saw yesterday and underscores that the man really is pushing for peace.
That's an interesting perspective. I hadn't really thought about it in quite that way. It certainly gives, I would say, it gives Donald Trump more credit as a negotiator who's able to put his ego aside for the sake of a deal than I would. But then again, I guess maybe I could spin it another way and say that, well, if his ultimate goal is to get the Nobel Peace Prize, and this would almost certainly cement that, if Hillary Clinton's going to nominate him, hell. But I think that you could, I guess, say that, well, ultimately it's about ego because he wants that Nobel Peace Prize. But I don't know. I've always been skeptical of the sort of 3D chess sort of explanations. I'm not saying you're wrong. In fact, for the sake of peace, I hope you're right. And I hope that Trump is the one that's playing Putin. I don't think that's what I think is going to happen is this. I think that if there does end up being a meeting on Monday with Zelensky in the White House, I think Trump is going to present demands to Zelensky essentially and saying, listen, in fact, he said it, Russia is a big power. You're not. The onus is on Zelensky to make a deal. And I think he's going to say, listen, this is the deal. Take it or leave it. And if you leave it, then we're just going to walk away. I'm just going to walk away from this. And I don't think in the end that there are going to be any meaningful concessions on the part of Russia. And that what's going to happen is that this whole peace talks, if it even gets to that point, it's just going to string things along and allow Russia to, again, take more Ukrainian territory and more Ukrainian lives. And again, I hope I'm wrong about this. It would be better, certainly, for the world if you were right about this. But my take is that that's probably not going to be how it turns out. But we will find out in the weeks to come for sure.
Well, on what the ultimate deal is, I think it depends on what the ultimate deal is. because Trump has been blunt, actually, about not getting caught in the other vice of, even with your allies, that you have to support your allies to the hilt on their most maximalist position on their principle, and that you're just the guy, the enforcer in the schoolyard fight that folks are in, that they have positions that they want to be maximalist, that you've got to be stuck in. So there's a lot of there's a lot of range for what's a reasonable outcome to end the war for long-term lasting peace and security guarantees. And I think that lasting peace, including potential security guarantees. There are rumors about possibility of some European peacekeeping troops on the ground in Ukraine. And I think that if ultimately what the goal is for Ukraine is a lasting peace related to protecting the sovereignty of their nation around Kyiv, then I think there's going to be room for that. And the president, though, is not going to abide Ukraine rejecting any possible path there to say, no, it's got to be our way or there's no peace. And, oh, by the way, America, you have to fund this. And eventually you're going to have to bring troops over and fight and die for our maximalist position. And a couple things can be true at once. And I don't think the president, if it's a reasonable deal, being direct with Ukraine and saying, look, this is a good deal, I don't think that's wrong, but it's going to depend on the substance of the deal. But ultimately, the probability of getting to that point where Ukraine actually has some sort of guaranteed highest probability of maintaining its security depends on ceasing hostilities, beefing up European ability to defend itself, which he's doing in NATO, and then having Russia enter into giving up its conquest at the moment in a way that Vladimir Putin does not have to essentially say on the world stage, I got beat by Vladimir Zelensky next door in the smaller nation. Because that last part, he can't do that. That's unrealistic to expect. I heard a reporter shout out from the audience when they were walking up, Mr. Putin, did you underestimate Ukraine? Which is a fair question, but that there's actually no path to peace under that, because he cannot and he's not going to acknowledge defeat in a war. He would make himself be defeated. That's the exact result and path we want to avoid.
No, and that's a good point. Yeah, and I think again, I mean, we're without knowing what sort of deal is potentially on the table, it's so difficult to say. But you're right in that it all depends on what deal does Trump suggest to Zelensky as a way to move forward on this, and is it something that is in fact reasonable? And when that comes out, then we'll have a lot more substance to talk about. And so now it's sort of strategy and optics and all that kind of mushy stuff. And I mean, biases on both sides come into play, understandably so. But it's just so difficult to know without something more substantive, which is frustrating. How it's a lot more frustrating for the people in Ukraine who are dying every day on this. But yeah.
Well, it'll give continued substance for the politics guys to talk about on the next show, no doubt. Well, Mike, we could go ahead and pivot now, moving on from peace on the world stage to law and order at home. The President of the United States invoked his authority under DC's Home Rule Act, Section 740 of DC's Home Rule Act, to impose the Attorney General's power over DC's police force for purposes of imposing law and order over the District of Columbia. It's been met with protest and resistance, but yet is arguably the most unique situation of law and order that exists within any locality within the United States of America. Is what we're seeing the advancement of law and order or authoritarianism run amok?
That's an interesting way to. I guess I'll reject the binary. How about? I think you can have both. But let me put it this way. I guess I am torn. I think in a way, so are some DC officials, at least initially, because I think the mayor said at some point earlier on that, this is this is great. In some ways, you didn't say this is great, but that, we need more officers on the streets. And if this can help us be more secure and safe, well, in some ways, that's a good thing. And so I get that argument. I mean, it's not like, well, Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And so when he talks about anything, he talks about it in bombastic, hyperbolic terms. And so DC can't just have a crime problem that's getting better, but not quickly enough. That's the sort of thing that you'd hear a normal politician say. It's got to be a festering cesspool of awfulness and crime where you can't walk 10 feet without getting mugged. And that's just how Trump speaks. I get that. And expecting anything different is ridiculous. And so, but I understand the folks who fear the authoritarianism, especially when, at least initially, I think that Attorney General Bondi, I'm assuming on the president's orders, pushed even further and said, listen, this is a great opportunity for us, not just to do this, to get tougher on crime, but also to clear the homeless encampments and to do a lot of immigration enforcement. And so that's, I think, when people said, wait a second. Oh, and by the way, we're taking over the DC police. We're not actually just working with them. Now, of course, that actually created a certain amount of controversy. And up until yesterday, well, that was after DC sued on those grounds, saying that exceeded the president's authority under the home rule law. And I don't think either side admitted wrongdoing in that, but there was sort of a settlement where the administration stepped back a little bit, saying that, okay, we're not going to install an emergency police chief who has personnel and all that sort of authority. But it's like I said, I am very torn on this because DC does have crime problems. They're certainly not as great as the president has suggested, but they're probably also greater than, I would argue, they're greater than what the Metropolitan Police Department says they are. There's some discrepancy, of course, between their violent crime stats and the FBI stats, but things do seem to be getting better. And was this strictly necessary? I don't think so. I wish it were handled differently, but we're at where we're at. And I guess I'm curious to see what's going to happen once things develop and we get close to that 30-day deadline period. Will this continue on? Will President Trump get the authorization from the joint resolution of Congress that he needs? And if he doesn't, will he try to find some authority to continue on without that? I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, I agree that it'll be interesting to see how it plays out after the 30 days, because in some level we're in uncharted waters. That this is just people making history happen in real time. I am not torn about this, but I think it's an interesting dynamic. Why? Because I have very strong local control impulses. I'm a firm believer that all progress is local, is a principle in general, and I have very strong federalism impulses. But the District of Columbia is not a state. It is the federal government's backyard. It's the federal government's geography. And it exists under the complete, total, and absolute authority of the federal government. The only reason that there's a mayor, there's a city council, that there's any ostensible local decision making, it's because it exists at the pleasure of the federal government. And the fact that I would say that feels weird coming off of my tongue. It's weird to even have come out of my mouth because I'm usually slower to accept the exercise of federal power, but it's appropriate because it is the federal government space. The federal government has to be able to act within its space. And so the limitations, one thing to keep in mind that's important for the listeners, and there was the Attorney General, they edited their orders at the insistence of the judge in response to the temporary restraining order potential proceedings. And they actually edited why they did what they were doing so that the emergency commissioner was not, they went back to the text of Section 740, which envisions the chain of command being the executive directs the mayor. So it was no more dramatic than that last night. But what you need to realize about that is not a vertical federalism type issue of the president's power. That's a horizontal separation of powers issue. It's an issue of this is what Congress has said, and the president has to follow the statute. That's where the limitations of his power and authority are related to the policing and beautification and law and order in DC. It is not his power versus the locality. The locality exists completely at the pleasure of the federal government. And that's the way it's set up from the founding. And that's the way it is constitutionally, where the federal government has complete control over the locality. So I think as a practical matter, our federal capital needs to be safe and our federal capital needs to be clean. And if the federal government, if the executive of the federal government needs to enforce the law and make sure that the law is enforced in the Capitol, to make sure to have it be to reflect the highest quality of who we are as a nation within its own backyard, I think it's extremely appropriate.
I
and I think so. Ultimately, there's going to be political fights because of the grandstanding clickbait political maneuvering. That's just the reality of politics. That is, even with the explosion of different medias, is the reality of our politics today. There's going to be fights over. There'll be a Spartacus moment in Congress, I'm sure, over DC, and fights about what the president's trying to do that's anti-Trump related to this. But fundamentally, the DC locality does not have any real right to tell the executive what the executive can and cannot do with respect to law and order and safety within the District of Columbia. Congress, there's a Congress dynamic, not the locality. That's pure optics in my mind. It's not structural.
I agree to the extent that you're absolutely right that DC is entirely under the ultimate control of the federal government. I think maybe where we part ways a little bit is my reading of Section 740 of the Home Rule Act is a little bit different. I read the relevant provision to require cooperation, the use of providing such services of the Metropolitan Police Force as the president may deem necessary and appropriate. I wanted to quote the actual text. And to me, providing services is different from authorizing a takeover. And so I agree that the president can say, listen, we need you to do X. That is within the law as I understand it. But saying that we need you to do X and we are going to take over your department, I think that actually goes beyond the statutory, what the statute allows. And so that's where I think we have a bit of a disagreement. I'm certain at some point a judge will probably rule on this, right? But there's a difference there, I think.
Well, yeah, they'll have to. But if you think about a judiciary will likely weigh in on the nuances of this, but because it's also not overly defined, and we're in uncharted territory. So I think President Trump adheres to the law. He's got really smart attorneys working around him that care about the rule of law, and he does too. And I know the narrative is he's authoritarian, but if you watch subtleties of the way he talks about, I think this is legal. We're going to push to the extent of of what we can do. He's not, I don't really care what the courts say, despite the long history of his involvement in the courts and in lawfare. He does not have a banana republic ethos to the courts that you often see in other countries where you have a strong man who runs the country. His demeanor, as much as his demeanor is bombastic toward Gavin Newsom, and yes, as much as his demeanor can be bombastic toward courts when he disagrees with their opinion, when you read between the lines, he still respects the separation of powers and the role courts play. And when they decide something, he acts accordingly based on what their decision is. But this is not, so what we're doing in real time is they're making this up as they go along. That doesn't mean that they're ill prepared. It just means it's the reality. It's like the founding of the country. Is the Constitution a perfect document? No. Should that be surprising to us? No. Why? I don't know. Maybe because they were making it up as they went along. No one in the history of mankind had done it. It's not like the federalization of Washington, D.C. is something that's happened 6 times in the last 50 years in America. So there's an element of this that in real time, it's real people doing real things, and these things are going to have to be liquidated and worked out as they go. But the executive, I think in thinking about the interpretive limits of Section 740 and how it can limit the president, you have to remember, too, though, that separation of powers concerns go both ways. So Congress makes law and the president enforces the law. But the president also has within his energy, he's the executor. He is the executor of the law. And there are spheres of the president's executional authority and his discretion that Congress cannot completely control. So there are probably going to be formulaic steps that a court would say the president has to take. But even a Biden appointed judge is probably going to be deferential to not constraining the discretion of the executive, which you can imagine a conservative appointed judge in the next Democrat administration. You know, we love to constrain the overreach of government authority, especially when it's a Democrat administration.
Yeah.
And you can imagine what they would do. They would try to do the same thing. So courts are generally pretty deferential of not wanting to overly cabin the discretion of the executive, especially because libs have more centralized power. I mean, this is not charitably framed, but it's my honest view. So apologies to anybody who disagrees with it. Libs naturally have more centralized power impulses on average. So the executive acting through the power is a value that my friends who think differently in the long run would always want. So I don't think it's going to be overly constrained. And there are issues related to you can't control. What does controlling the police department mean? Because ultimately in life, the ultimate question is who decides and who has control. I don't think Congress can tell the president, you can give some suggestions to the mayor of DC, and then the mayor of DC, if you say that you can exercise your authority over the district, I don't know that the court's going to be able to draw artificial lines to say you can make suggestions to the mayor of DC and the mayor of DC can reject them, because the ultimate question becomes who decides. And I think even though there's some technical aspects of the president acting through the mayor rather than getting to potentially redo the entire leadership establishment of DC outside the statute, that is different than the president now decides. So basically, 740 allows the president in an emergency declared. Now the president's deciding about law and order in the district and not the local authorities. And how that chain of command happens and how the procedure of that happens is one thing. But the ultimate question of who decides, it's the president. And there's not within the 30 days that are allowed, I do not think there is a real plausible path for DC to change that and engineer a way to be creative where the DC District of Columbia local leadership who disagrees with the president still decides. I don't think that's actually a result that's plausible amongst all the smart lawyering that can happen and go on, because the fundamental foundational bedrock principle is the federal government controls DC. The president executes the laws in the preservation and the safety of the federal nation. And Congress has said in this situation, the president has authority to make decisions. And although the specifics of it are going to work out in real time as we're making this up as we go along, the result is required.
Yeah.
In this instance.
Yeah, in the end, I agree with that. Ultimately, once an emergency has been declared, that happens. I guess one point out, an earlier point you made, I'll disagree on, is my interpretation isn't that Donald Trump respects the other branches. I feel like more than any, I think all presidents come to see the other branches as impediments when they don't do what they want them to do. But I think Donald Trump, more than most, and for a couple of reasons. I think number one, just his personality. He's the guy who likes to move fast and break things. Maybe that's why he feels comfortable with J.D. Vance, kind of techie guy for his. But also, I think because he's a very, I get the sense he's a very emotional guy. I think a big reason for this whole thing is that 19-year-old former Doge guy who got almost carjacked and assaulted, and I feel like that plays to Donald Trump's, he's got that sort of emotional sort of reaction to these things. And I believe that's authentic. And also I feel that in light of what he feels are relentless, unfair attacks against him by the judiciary, by Congress, by even some of his own party in Congress. His own personality just makes it really difficult for him to separate that out. And so I think he feels that these things would be much better if he could just do what he wants. I think that's why, for instance, he sort of admires Putin and other strongman leaders, because I think he believes, I know what's right. And if everyone else would just get out of my way. I mean, humility is never a big thing for U.S. presidents, but much less for Donald Trump than any other U.S. president, certainly in my lifetime. And so I think this sets up this sort of adversarial dynamic. And it's at the point where if you disagree with President Trump on anything of substance, you are automatically not just wrong, but a bad person. And that to me is a sea change in American politics. And I think it's a very damaging one. And certainly I expect whoever, the Democratic nominee is, that Gavin Newsom's trying to play the same game. And to me, it's just, I know we're kind of getting off track here, but it's just pretty depressing to me, I guess.
What's your take on the politics of the DC policing?
I think it's brilliant politics. I think this is Donald Trump either on purpose or just by coincidence walking Democrats into another trap. And I feel like we're falling right into it, because I know for not so much for myself, but for a lot of my friends who are also on the left, the sight of seeing National Guard troops on the streets and all this, that's like, oh my God, authoritarian takeover. I don't think that's how it plays to a lot of Americans. I know for a fact that attributions of crime, Americans think there's a lot more crime, especially in big cities, than there is. And that's probably, I don't know, TV shows, all the true crime podcasts and all that sort of thing. Whatever the reason, it's a real thing. We've known this from research for a long time. And so if President Trump says, you know what, things are awful in D.C., look at what happened to this poor young kid and this other stuff, point to these very vibrant images, and I'm doing something about it. I'm cleaning up the city. I'm sending in the troops. I think to a lot of Americans, that's a real strong, positive message. And to hear folks on the left saying, oh, you can't do that, I think that's out of touch. I mean, that's my general beef with the Democratic Party as it exists today. I think it's too enthralled to a small group of folks who don't really have a sense of what a lot of Americans feel, rightly or wrongly. You're not going to argue them out of that. So I think politically, it's just walking my party into another trap. And it looks like too many of my fellow Democrats are falling into it, unfortunately.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think that anecdotally, with family and friends and myself experiences in and out of the DC area, there has been a long-standing belief that it is unsafe, that it's going to hell in a handbasket, and that the lesser angels of leftist ideology are not helping that dynamic. And I think even in Trump's first term, he had, if you remember, there were multiple highly salient dynamics in the Capitol that were rubbing up against his views that the Capitol is not safe and is a hellhole and needs to be fixed. And I think, though, one of the interesting things is American history and Donald Trump's consequential place in it, and the story of Donald Trump and his electoral wins and losses, is that I think that this move in actually doing it, I don't know if the recent deaths, if the young man in the carjacking incident and the intern that was shot, I don't know if those were catalysts, but I wonder if Donald Trump won in 2020 and was the president, I don't know if this action's taken, but after the entirety of everything that went on, Donald Trump his presidency's already extremely consequential, and it's going to be even more consequential with a capital C. And I think because of all of the history and the backstory, he's just at a place where we're just going to fix everything. We're not going to talk about, oh, I wish life was better and how can we make a better world? I can't touch this sacred cow. I can't touch this extra rail. He's touching all of them, and he's touching a whole lot of them immediately. And I think this is something that has been long overdue. And you even watch MSNBC, the more liberal cable news networks, and you start to hear some commentators who live in DC, they have essentially agreed that, hey, it's not a terrible thing to clean up DC. We want to live in a nice place and it should be safe. And folks know that there's a problem. But I think that this action itself, the fact we're talking about, we're making this up as we go along. No, but people haven't really done it before. I think that is to the president's credit and is something about the current state of the world we're living in, where he's doing things to make a better world. But without all of the history, I don't actually know that he would have rocked this boat the same way if he had been president from 20 to 24. I think that in some way there's even less inhibition to stir the swamp and kick the sacred cows now. I think that's a healthy thing. There's going to be more safe. People are going to be safer in DC because of it.
Well, he's doing a lot. I would say not a lot of it to make the country better, but of course we would disagree on that part. But I guess I'm wondering of this. Generally speaking, I feel like when you go in and do something like this, it's a good idea. Sometimes it's a really important idea to have an exit strategy. In other words, okay, this emergency situation exists. What will it take? What will the indicators? What will the metrics be to say that we are no longer in a state of emergency? And I think especially this is what really sets off a lot of red flags to folks for this action. So, well, we're going in. We're not really saying when we're going out. We're going to have to sort of figure it out as we go along. For a lot of folks, that feels very much like an authoritarian playbook. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to say to the administration, okay, you say there's an emergency. We dispute that, but ultimately you get to make that call, basically. But when will it not be an emergency? And I don't think it's appropriate to say to the American people, I don't know, we'll just figure it out as we go along. It should have something to do with some sort of measurable metrics relating to, I don't know, guns, crime, something like that. And if the administration can't provide that, I feel like it's failing the American people and it's failing the residents of D.C.
Well, I've got the real answer for you on that question. It's no longer going to be necessary when the Democratic Party fixes its orientation toward law and order. Or else it's going to perpetually. But I think that's the reality in the real political world that we live in. Because as long as it's a Republican president, and this Republican president over the District of Columbia responsible for enforcing it, if the District of Columbia does its job with law and order and enforces the law and keeps people safe, there's no reason for the federal government to do it. But there's a real problem going back to the Biden-Clinton early 90s years of tough on crime. And maybe that was just politics. Maybe their views have changed. Maybe in order to survive in the Democratic Party, that the McGovern on steroids, leftist ideological impulses that I think now control the party are just so strong. You can't poke that bear unless that changes where the Democrats can actually impose law and order. It's going to the president has smarter attorneys working for him than me by far. So I haven't thought about this issue multiple steps out with the duration, and they'll have a take. But I think it can be as simple as there's no limitation, I don't think, on the 30 days recurring. I mean, you can almost in perpetuity, couple days, they're not doing it, or another week, they're not doing it. Oh, guess what? It's another emergency. That if they don't do it, he can do it, make sure they do it in perpetuity. But the real answer is you have political constituencies on the left and in the Democratic Party that make it really hard for the Democratic leaders to be law and order. The one thing you could say about the old school machine politicians out of Chicago was, we may be corrupt as all get out, but we're going to throw your butt in jail. So there's an element of that in the reality that until the Democratic Party polices itself and gets that piece back right, I think as long as there's a Republican president, the answer is it's going to happen when the Dems start doing law and order again within the District of Columbia.
I certainly agree, at least on the politics of it. On the substance, I'm sure we would have a number of disagreements about policing and law enforcement, but on the politics of it, I agree. And that's definitely a big problem for my party on this, and something that I split with certainly the more progressive elements of my fellow Democrats on. The other thing I wanted to mention on this is, and something that hasn't been reported as much, is that Trump has called for a DC security fund to help with crime in the district. Now, there aren't that many details yet, but according to Lindsey Graham, he's chair of the Senate Budget Committee. That's one of the committees that would be taking this up in when the budget gets passed later in the year, is that it would be some sort of a pool of money to hire more officers and prosecutors in the MPD and in the DC area. I think that would be a great idea. I'd like to see that played up a little bit more, because I think that's a way to say, listen, you can do these things in a way that is cooperative and collaborative. Maybe that isn't President Trump's first instinct, but I think something like this is definitely, I would hope, is something there could be some bipartisan agreement on. And I'm curious to see what that's going to look like. But I certainly think the ultimate way forward is to make sure that DC has the resources, wherever they come from, to ensure that residents are fairly safe. Now, for any big urban area, there's always going to be a certain amount of crime, but certainly we can do better and we should do better. And I would hope that that's something that everyone can agree on.
Yeah, more resources for law enforcement is a good idea. And I hope that Congress does whatever is necessary to give the district as much law enforcement resource as that it needs. The ultimate question just comes down to want to. And I disagree on, I think the president's impulse as a deal maker, especially, he'd be more than happy to work with anybody to get the results, but he's not going to pretend that bipartisanship as a dog and pony result for the other side to still maintain control when the American people elected him. He's just not going to abide. He's not going to abide by that. And he's going to do his job.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think we have time for, we would be doing listeners a disservice if we didn't talk about the third big story that happened this week, and that is in redistricting. California Governor Gavin Newsom announced a redistricting ballot measure he's planning for November 4th. And at the announcement event, Newsom told the crowd, on November 4th in California, you have the power to stand up to Trump, the power to declare that you support a system that is not rigged. Or I guess I'd say more accurately, California voters have the power to rig their system in response to Texas rigging their own system. Though, that doesn't sound nearly as impressive. I digress. But Newsom is calling this, I don't know. I've got my issues with Newsom, but that's a whole other story. I find him to be an icky person for a lot of reasons. I'm trying not to let that color this, but it's so, I got to say, Joey, this is an aside. I feel like it's harder when it's someone on your side that you dislike. It just, I don't know, for me, I feel more betrayed. Anyway, but so Newsom's calling this the Election Rigging Response Act. Like I said, apparently he thinks if President Trump can use the word rig without any real concern for what it actually means, well, so can he. Fine. Anyway. But the ballot measure first needs to be approved by the state legislature. Then it would go before voters in a special election in November. And we haven't seen the text, but it's expected it will contain a provision that any new California maps will only go into effect if Texas or other Republican states approve new maps of their own. It's also expected that this measure will only be in effect until 2030, at which point district drawing in California will go back to the authority of that independent redistricting commission that California voters approved in 2010. Now, Newsom clearly has his work cut out for him here. I mean, early polling suggests that California voters aren't really interested in changing that system they approved back in 2010. In fact, quick political poll that was done right after the announcement found that only 36% of Californians were in favor of returning redistricting authority to state lawmakers from that independent commission. Now, a lot can change, and hundreds of millions of dollars is going to be spent on this effort. So I'm not saying that's how it's going to end up, but it's going to be a tough job for Governor Newsom. What do you think about what he's proposing, Joey?
Well, I think on the politics of it, it's a big gamble for Governor Newsom. I think that if it doesn't go his way, it probably sinks or comes close to sinking his primary ambitions. But if it goes his way, I think it helps him. So, I mean, on some level, he clearly wants to be the president of the United States. You can't hit the ball if you don't swing the bat. And I think that this is his attempt. If it's successful, I think just pure Democrat politics, it sets him up for a stronger position in the primary. And so I think it's politically smart, but if it doesn't work, it's going to be a huge destructive dynamic for his chances. In the California politics that are interesting, I think that the current electoral system or the current districting dynamic was a huge baby of Arnold Schwarzenegger's. So it's going to create a clash of personalities. And I expect that the governor is going to be a very active opponent to the effort. It'll be interesting to see how those politics play out. The meta narrative of we need to fight fire with fire, I think is ridiculous, because probably not surprising to anybody. I think the libs have been far more effective with gerrymandering and map drawing for themselves than Republicans have been up to this point. And even the independent commission dynamic in California has a dynamic where Trump gets about 40% of the vote and Republicans have 17% of the House seats. So it's already in a way, the maps are still always in a way that favor Democrats. So I understand the narratives. I don't agree with them, but fundamentally, districting is a political process. And I know that making sausage can be messy, but ultimately the entire American experience is a political process. The people can change the Constitution. The people in their states can live differently than people in other states. So this is an issue that is going to get a lot of media posturing for purposes of people's own political ambitions and meta-narrative fights related to midterm issues. But it itself is not an actual real, in my mind, a real substantive issue that should be determining how people vote for purposes of the midterm and how they want their lives to be run. But the politics of it are certainly interesting. And I think within California, they're going to be interesting as they play out, especially with the Schwarzenegger Newsom dynamic. But it's a big move for Newsom. It's a big gamble. On the other hand, you can't play in the big leagues if you never take the bat off your shoulder. So I think just pure politics, I think it's a smart move by him.
Yeah, I would agree on that for sure. And I would disagree on the assertion that Democrats are better at gerrymandering or rigging. I mean, that's not just me. There's been plenty of research. For instance, the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which looks at gerrymandering across all 50 states. If you take a look at their findings, pretty much all the states that seem to be the most gerrymandered, the most political in their redistricting are in fact deeper red states, including Texas. I mean, I think what many people don't realize about gerrymander or about redistricting is, yes, it is political, but it is also geographic. And by that, I mean, if we take the case of California, you mentioned that disparity between the vote total and the percentage of the House delegation. Well, that in large part has to do much more not with rigging the system, but actually with geography, because of the nature of California's Republicans. There aren't a ton of them. There are a fair amount of them, but the way that they're spread out makes it really difficult to draw districts in such a way that reflect those or that meet those legal requirements of that they be contiguous, that they be compact, and that they abide by non-discrimination legislation. And so, I mean, this is not a rigged system. How California's system is set up, it truly is an independent commission. A lot of people don't really recognize how it works, but in California, the commission has 14 people, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 people that are unaffiliated. And it's this labyrinth, a Byzantine sort of system designed to make sure every side get these peremptory challenges and that the minority and majority leaders of the state House and the state Senate have equal a number of it's really designed to be about as truly independent as you can make anything like this, which is why as Vice President Vance did, putting up this and saying, well, look here's the vote percentage, and here's our percentage of the House delegation. That's really misleading. I'm sure J.D. Vance knows that. I mean, both sides play this game. It's gerrymandering is fine when it's done for our side, but when it's the other side, it's this disastrous, horrific sort of thing. And so I think that's just politics.
Well, I agree. I agree. It's politics. Have you ever seen the visual of the Illinois maps? The way the Illinois congressional districts are done?
Illinois got some problems. And in fact, it is
Illinois. It's humorous.
Yep.
But Illinois is an interesting state because Illinois is is a monument to concentration of population centers. Illinois is almost entirely red. It's because it's very rural outside of a couple areas, if you're just doing geography. But the population centers are extremely blue. And so the map of Illinois, I encourage anybody to just pull it up and look at the congressional districts. There's one or two that are they're almost humorous. They do represent the salamander, gerrymander from the original expression where it came from to the hilt. But representation itself is a bigger issue that involves other dynamics that still are ultimately a question about power that people don't realize or even talk about, such as the census issue. And we're not talking about this stuff today, so we don't go on a rabbit trail. I'm raising it for purposes of it's actually an all things considered issue. The census issue and how census is done and who counts in census for purposes of apportionment of votes. Because blue states that concentrate populations, including illegal immigrants, for census-related dynamics, for apportionment, get a disproportionate representation benefit. And so that means in a world, something I always love to say I love about America is that one person, one vote, your voice counts as much as a past president of the United States. But actually, with the census dynamic, that's not really true, because where you have concentration of people counting for folks who are not citizen voters, then people in those areas proportionally, their voice actually counts more than people in the other localities. So the dynamic about the way power is done is a complicated, all things considered, dynamic that is not surprising since the dawn of time. It's the way it is, and it's the way it's always going to be. But I think it's healthy to be able to be honest and talk about all aspects of it and move it forward and let the American people ultimately decide the way they want the railroad to run and have decisions to be made. And the people in California, I'm interested to see how it plays out. Fundamentally, the people in California get to make decisions about how California is run. But the president's efforts, if you care about votes counting and equality and people's voices counting the same and apportionment to be fair and the people in America to decide and we're all equal, then the president's efforts regarding the census are directly on point with those concerns too.
Yeah, of course, I would disagree with you on that, but that would get into that whole issue of who should be counted in for what reasons. I think I think you and the president are dead wrong on that. But like you said, a whole other issue. But your larger point about, that being an advantage to states in which there are more undocumented workers, that would also include states like, for instance, very red Texas, for instance, or Florida, for instance. But I think that, we on the left have been making that argument about the Senate, where, these very sparsely populated, often red states have just as much representation in the Senate as blue, or Washington, D.C., which, doesn't have any true representation in Congress. And that's, of course, largely Democratic. So I get the argument without a doubt,
And yet many folks from the other side want to have two senators in the District of Columbia. And I laughed. You got to appreciate the politics, too,
yeah.
Mike. People are going to be on both sides of an issue just for purposes of opposing. I laughed when the first time I saw the actual proposal from Newsom about that's cleverly done to say it's temporary. It's only if they do. Like the model of restraint. And not only are we the model of restraint, only if they do, but it's temporary. Just these 3 cycles that would be this midterm, my presidential election year, and then my midterm of my first term. I laughed when I saw that. I laughed.
Well, see, this is why. Yeah, this is why.
It's funny how that works.
God, I guess this is why I just find the whole thing. It just kind of, at my heart, I guess I'm somewhat of a romantic when it comes to this stuff, and so I know that I've already gotten some flack from folks on the left saying, like, how can you be for California not doing this? It's not just because Arnold Schwarzenegger was a hero of mine when I was a kid growing up or anything like that. I hope that's not reason why, but okay, admittedly. But it's that I believe in the principle of it. And I believe that congressional districts are supposed to be constructed as discrete communities of interest so that folks can be better represented by their leaders. And I know that's insanely naive, but there's a part of me that does not want to let go of that because I believe it's just so crucial to what we are supposed to be as a representative democracy. And when I see that slipping away, when I see it being done just so brazenly by both sides, it honestly, and make fun of me for being a sappy, patriotic, whatever, it makes my heart hurt. It really does. And if that makes me a sap, then I guess I'm a sap.
Well, there's nothing wrong, pal, with wanting a better world. I think that the point about that it's just the reality of the way it works and it's been that way since the dawn of time, I think is important. I just look at it as I don't think we're losing anything. I think the question is, who do we want to be and how do we want to be? And what are the wisest ways to go about trying to make a better world? And I do agree. I think you're noble. Your impulses are noble. And the idea of people being able to vote for and have their representative be responsive to them and the American ideal is something that is worth it for all of us to push on and to keep making better and to try to make a better world. There's nothing wrong about that. That's the beauty of being an American. We have the freedom to try to make a better world.
Amen. That is, yeah. Well, before we end this episode, I want to let folks know about another podcast that I'm a big fan of, Sustainable Planet. Now, it is hosted by my spouse, political scientist Kimberly Weir, and her co-host and longtime Politics Guy supporter, Jordan Dye. Their most recent episode, they're looking at travel, which is a huge industry, much bigger than I realized. U.S. travelers spent over, no kidding, $1 trillion last year. And with so many people, flying, driving, otherwise, I don't know, bicycling, who knows, whatever, relocating for some time off, it is reasonable to wonder what the environmental costs might be. And that's something that Kimberly and Jordan dig into in this episode. They both do a lot of traveling. They're not these folks who say, these environmental scolds, say, stay at home with the lights out, the AC off, and just be miserable and sweaty. They're concerned about, well, how can we travel in perhaps a more sustainable way? It's an interesting episode. I thought so. I hope you'll check it out. And as always, I will put a link in the show notes. And also, as always, if there is something you disagreed with one of us or both of us, we think you're both full of it, guys, whatever, or you got a question about, let us know. We love hearing from listeners. You can do that a bunch of ways. There's our email, mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us through Facebook or X. Links are in the show notes. And there's also our Discord discussion forum supporters. I am on that all the time. Probably too much. I probably need to seek some sort of therapy for that, but there you go. I don't know. But if you become a supporter, you get access to that Discord as well as ad-free versions of all of our episodes, that full-length midweek episode instead of just the 15-minute or so snippet that we give you as a preview. I mentioned access to that Discord and other stuff as well. We hope you'll check it all out. I always put support links in the show notes, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. And if you want to get that full-length midweek show, but you're not financially in a position where you can support us, we get that. I'm happy to help you out with that. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And regardless of whether you're a supporter or not, one thing you can do, it just takes a few seconds, that really helps us out, is subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on whatever podcast app you're using, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And as always, before we close, a very special thanks to our fantastic executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,